in computer architecture. Today, Dr. Emer is speaking on exploiting sparsity in deep neural network accelerator hardware. Dr. Emer?
Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction. So as Professor Bader said, I'm going to be talking about exploiting sparsity in deep neural network accelerators. And as maybe you got a little bit of a sense from the introduction, my approach is often trying to understand the space of designs and understand more deeply what the alternatives are and create taxonomies as opposed to always just working on individual designs. Not that I don't do that as well. So that's going to be the focus of this talk, actually. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that what I'm going to be talking about here has been influenced and contributed to by a large number of people that I have collaborated with, and they're all listed, or probably an incomplete list is included here. So, sparsity. Point is that there are a lot of problems that use sparse tensors. What do I mean by sparsity? Generally, we mean a tensor or multidimensional array that has a lot of zeros in it, or some number of zeros. And here's a chart that was published a few years ago that shows that sort of the problem domains for that have tensors of varying sparsities. So you see here, actually, the chart happens to be listed in density, which is 1 minus sparsity. So 100% density means no sparsity at all. And in this range from sort of actually probably 5% to 100%, we see neural networks. And then increases, or the density decreases, there's lots of other graphs that might. So although I'm going to focus largely on how to deal with deep learning computations, the principles I'm going to talk about should be actually applicable across this broad range. So why is it that sparsity is relevant to design? Well, the point is that there are opportunities for exploiting sparsity. And although I guess exploiting things is generally frowned upon, we don't view data as a particularly protected class. So exploiting sparsity in data is perfectly okay. So what can we do in the case of sparsity? First is that sparse data can be compressed. If there's a lot of zeros in the data, then you can often compress it, consuming less space. And so the benefits of that are I can save space. And we also can save energy by avoiding the manipulation of these zero values, because we don't need to move them around. The other facts that we can use to exploit sparsity is taking advantage of some very simple algebraic properties. And the first one is that any number multiplied by 0 is 0. We tend to refer to this as an ineffectual computation because the result is 0. And of course, it's very easy to do, because if we ever see that we're going to multiply by a 0, we don't actually need to do any work. The other similar algebraic property that we can take advantage of is that anything plus 0 is that original value. So again, we don't need to expend any effort when we see that we're going to add to a 0. By taking advantage of these algebraic properties, we can save time and energy by avoiding fetching unnecessary operands and avoiding using any hardware on the ineffectual computations. So how much benefit might there be from these? Well, this was a graph we generated some time ago of a pruned version of the popular AlexNet model. And what the two bars are showing is, we're again talking about density here, is the density of the input activations, the one input to the convolution, and the density of the filter weights. And we see in the first stages that they're relatively dense, but then as we get to later and later stages, the sparsity actually increases, or the density decreases quite significantly. So if we can avoid, if we only look at the input activations in this stage of the network, we could avoid 60% of the computations, or a little bit more than 60% of the computations if we took advantage of the weights. The yellow triangles are, what if you could take advantage of the fact that either of the operands is 0? Then we don't have to do a multiply whether when either is. And so now we're talking about, only needing to do something less than 20% of the computations. If we could save time for that, we could get a 5x speed up for this. And these numbers are actually relatively conservative. This was a later study on pruning of the weights in various different models. And what you see here is that if you prune and don't want to lose any accuracy, actually you're not seeing pointer. Okay, so if you're not willing to lose any accuracy, you can prune up to 90% of the weights, and in other networks, again, you can get up to 90% sparsity if you're willing to tolerate a little bit of loss. So there's been lots of work that has been proposed, lots of designs. Here's a sampling of designs that have been proposed in order to exploit sparsity, in order to improve performance of convolutional neural network layers. And well, what you see here is the way they tend to be described as a block diagram of flows. So a couple of these designs are designs that I've been involved with, and they each exploit different factors or different features of the computation in order to save time or space with their where the problem is sparse. What I'm going to try and do in this talk is take a little bit of a step back and try and look more generally at the broad spectrum of, or the way to think about these techniques for exploiting sparsity. And I'm taking inspiration in part by the halide system developed by Jonathan Rogan Kelly and others, published a few years ago. And what he described for performing computations on dense data using CPUs or GPUs was that you can break down the way to think about the problem into 3 steps. One is that you specify what the problem you're working on is. Then you describe the algorithm that you would like to use. And then separately from the algorithm, you'd like to specify a schedule, an order of computation in order to optimize the behavior. So what I'm going to do is apply this breakdown of, basically this breakdown of the ways to think about a design of a DNN accelerator into these steps. So first step is, what is the problem? And the problem that I'm going to largely focus on is the standard convolution computation picture of the essentially showing how you convolve by doing element-wise multiplication of a set of filters against the input activations, and you do an element-wise multiply in each of these planes, add the results together, you generate one output in the output. Another reason I'm sort of showing this picture is I will be trying to use a consistent color scheme throughout the presentation, where when I've colored something green, it's going to be filter weights, and blues are going to be input activations or input feature maps, and red is going to be the output activations that comprise an output feature map. And what you do is you move that window around, covering all the input feature maps and with all the different filters to generate potentially multiple output feature maps for batch size larger than 1 and all the planes or output channels of the outputs. Okay, a more precise way of describing this, which you often see, is as a loop nest. So you have all of the indices of the tensors represented as different for loops, and then there's a computation in the body here that you traverse. There's sort of two disadvantages of thinking about it this way. Is, well, one, it's rather verbose, and two is it actually is implying an order of computation. It's actually implying a schedule here of the order that you're going to compute things in. And you'd in some ways rather not do that. So what I'm going to use is another technique for expressing these kinds of algorithms. I'm going to first describe it if you haven't heard of it, or you may have heard of it. I'm going to describe it in the context of matrix multiplication. And this is what's called the Einsum notation. It was a notation that was originally proposed by Albert Einstein for describing some tensor computations in physics. It's more recently been used by both the Taco sparse tensor compiler and the time loop tool for analyzing the performance of CNNs as a way of specifying the problem. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with it, what is it doing? An operational definition is if you've specified here each of the operands, each of the operand tensors, A, B inputs and output Z. And each of those tensors has a set of indices, which are labeled here. The operational definition of the Einsum is basically to traverse all of the legal values of the indices and do the prescribed operation. So it's showing you a multiplication here and then a summation over k's. The point is that if you look at this computation, it's very interesting to try and interpret the computational activities that you need to do based on the terms in the expression. So for this matrix multiply, if we look at the shared indices, so the K here is shared by both the A and the B operands, that is going to actually, in sparse computations, imply an intersection, because we only need the operands where K exists in both A and B. And so whenever we see shared indices, we know that there's going to need to be somewhere in the design an intersection. If there's a summation over an index, that's often referred to as a contracted index, that means that I'm going to do a reduction or summation. And so whenever I see, basically, the summation here is actually not required because it can be inferred. If I have an index on the right-hand side that does not appear on the left-hand side, then there's going to be a reduction or contraction across that index. if I have an uncontracted index, then it means that I'm going to need to populate some location, some point in the output. So M and N appear both on the input operands and the output. And so I know that I'm going to need to write an output at each of those, at the coordinates associated with those indices. As I said, we're going to try and look mostly at convolution. And so, and basically an extended form of the einsum allows one to specify a computation on the indices. And so a convolution, this is the convolution that we described before with the loop nest, is equivalent to saying, well, I want, as I traverse all of the indices, in order to find the location in the input activations that I want, I'm going to have to add the values of P and R and Q and S to find the location in the input activations. What does this mean in terms of computation? So that means when I see index arithmetic, it means I'm going to do a projection into the index based on a computation of those indices. So I need to be able to do a projection based on indices into the data, irrespective of the of exactly how the data is represented. So this is expressing the algorithm, but it hasn't said yet anything about the order of the computation, either in time or in space. And so I also want to talk about the schedule. And schedule is often characterized as the data flow of the computation, which is going to be how the hardware is organized. It's going to say something about how is data moved and stored hierarchically, how is processing split amongst parallel units, actually split both in time, which corresponds to tiling, or in space, which means that the computation may be parallelized. And also we care about what order is the data in the tensor process. Question is, can these choices be represented systematically? And the answer is yes. And I'm going to now, in order to make the presentation a little bit less overwhelming, I'm going to often tend to drop to a one-dimensional convolution. So this is the einsum for a one-dimensional convolution. And if I say that I want to first traverse all of the Q coordinates, or sorry, if my outermost traversal is over the Q coordinates and my innermost loop is over the S coordinates, then I can specify a data flow by just writing the successive for loops in that order. So given a schedule, I can write the for loops, and that will end up with a particular behavior. And so what I'm doing is showing the weight tensor, which is a vector because I'm in 1D, and the input activations and the outputs. And what do we see here is that as we step through the outputs, we keep on contributing to the same output. The filter weights, we step through repeatedly through all of the weights. And the input activations, we actually work on a current window inside the input activations. And that window steps through the vector of input activations. This data flow that we've now described is referred to as output stationary because the outputs stayed the same. You can end up with output stationary designs where you add parallelism. This is sort of a typical design for an output stationary where the outputs remain stationary in each of the processing elements of the design. And so we are basically minimizing partial sum read-write energy because we're doing a local accumulation. But after we design this this way, what we find is the weights are broadcast to all of the PEs, and the activations are used sequentially by the different PEs. And there have been designs that look like this, the Shidianao accelerator, where they drew a picture like this. I've colored the internals of the PE. The outside here is delivering data to each of the PEs. What does it do? Well, it delivers the weights by multicast to all of the PEs. The activations are sent to a PE, and then what you see here is that there's some scheduling of the activations going through the PE, where they are then delivered to the next PE. So that's that spatial communication between PEs. And there's this register here, which I meant to color red, which is the accumulation of the outputs. That's the output stationary. Okay, so this was for a this was for a dense, and in fact, you can have a variety of these data flows by permuting the loops, and so you can end up by permuting loops. You can turn an output stationary data flow into a weight stationary data flow. So what if the data is sparse? If the data is sparse, we cannot assume that the data is contained in an array. And so what we've realized is that the aspects of scheduling for sparse data has three main attributes. One of them is gating the data. This is just saying, if I see an ineffectual computation, just don't turn on the hardware and save energy. The second aspect is that we can change the format. So there's lots of representations that allow us to save storage energy, save storage space and energy accessing the data, because I don't have to access any data associated with zeros. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these options, but I'm going to, okay. And so in order to do that, I'm going to introduce some terminology here. So here is a two-dimensional tensor. And what we see here is that it has two dimensions. We're going to call those two dimensions ranks, and each of the ranks have a name. And so we have H and W for height and width. And we're also going to label the entries along each rank by something that we're going to call a coordinate. And so we have coordinates along the W rank of 0, 1, 2, and coordinates along the H of 0, 1, 2. And so now you can easily identify any point in the tensor with a pair of coordinates, 1, 2. Rather than draw the tensors like this, which does get harder as you go beyond 3 and 4 dimensions, I'm going to draw them as a tree. And so the point here is that I want to represent the tensors via an abstraction. And so I'm going to start with a tree-based tensor abstraction. I'm not advocating that anybody have in memory trees necessarily, but it's going to be an abstraction that is going to allow me to talk about the operations and the manipulations of tensors without regard to their specific implementation choice. And so the terminology we're going to use here for the tree, we're going to start with a root. Each of the layers of the tree as a rank. Notice that there is an order to the ranks, and that turns out to be so important in the behavior of operations on the tensor that it shines through to this abstract representation. we have the coordinates. So in our top rank, we have 0, 1, and 2. And each of those coordinates has a set of child coordinates in the next rank. And then each of those coordinates in this rank 2 structure has a payload, which is a value. I'm going to change that, although a tree like that is fine. I'm going to actually change that representation very slightly. And I'm going to group together the coordinates here into what I'm going to refer to as a fiber. This is very closely related to the mathematical use of the term fiber, which says, fix a set of coordinates, and then the set so I fix this top coordinate, and then the set of elements of the tensor with that coordinate fixed is a fiber. So this is the fiber of 1, fiber of coordinate 0, and 1 and 2. I'm also going to call this a fiber where in essence, I'm saying, well, I fixed the root. What are the coordinates associated with the root and their children? I'm going to ignore the fact that it's a subtree, but just say it's the payload of this coordinate. Finding a point in here is fairly straightforward. If I want to find the point 2, 1, I start at the root. I go to the top payload. The fiber in the top rank. I then find the coordinate 2 that I'm interested in. That gives me a pointer to a fiber in the next rank. Call this operation get payload. So it's get payload of a coordinate. And we do the same thing at the next level. We have a fiber. We say, look at the coordinate 1. That gives me a payload of h. This is get payload of 1. So it's quite straightforward, where get payload is an important operation that I'm going to want to do on tensors. What if the tensor is sparse? Finally getting to some mention of sparsity. What if the tensor is sparse? Well, in the matrix, I end up with a bunch of empty elements. These were the elements that had zeros in them. And in my tree, which we're going to refer to now as a fiber tree, if I have a row that is empty, that just simply means there is no h1 coordinate. And so I can eliminate the h1 coordinate. In this case, in the h0 row, there is no coordinate 1. And so this coordinate is going to go away. And similarly, there is no coordinate 2 in the second row, h row, and so it goes away. Finding a point works exactly the same way it does before. I step through finding point 2, 1 by going to the 2 coordinate, get payload, find a fiber, go to coordinate 1, find a fiber, find its payload, get payload of 1. Okay, so what is the information in a fiber? It really is a coordinate payload tuple. So for every coordinate, there is a payload. In the bottom rank, that's a value. In any intermediate rank, the payload of a coordinate is a reference to the fiber in the next rank. So what can I do with this? Well, I can express traversal through a rank 2 structure and sum all those elements. So essentially this einsum, which says for a rank 2 tensor with indices or ranks h and w, sum over all of them and generate an output. I can write this by providing a way of traversing or iterating over the tensor, which is going to iterate over the top rank. What do I get on a traversal? I get a tuple, which is a coordinate, and its payload. Its payload is another fiber, which by convention we just name with the rank name of the fibers, of th. That's another fiber. I can traverse that next fiber and get back tuples. And so the sequence is going to be I start with 0, 0. I step through after getting the payload of the top of the 0 coordinate in the top rank. I have this next fiber. I can get the coordinate and payload of the elements in the next fiber. I then move to the next fiber payload of the top rank and traverse that. Point is that representation maps directly to hardware. So just like we did in the dense case, where we were able to describe a piece of hardware from the loop nest, even in the sparse case, by using this abstraction for describing the tensor, I can describe a traversal. I've just shown the traversal, not the addition, just make it a little easier, through the fibers. I've used a dotted box to indicate that this is a sparse rank, and I'm working on the H rank. I step through the positions in it. As I do each position of the fiber, I get out a coordinate and its payload. That payload is a reference to a fiber in the next rank. So I know what fiber I'm working on. I step through those and I get back the coordinate and the scalar values. So I can step through that. That was the abstraction. And I'll just quickly go through. I can then, to optimize my design, I can pick a fiber representation. And so the simplest one is that I actually represent it as uncompressed data. So if the data is uncompressed, I have all these coordinates, and some of them are just empty. So this is a 1D structure, so it's just a fiber. And so what I have are the coordinates and the payloads. We also talk about, as I sort of mentioned before, we talk about in the fiber that there's a position. And when we're talking about an uncompressed or array of data, the position and the coordinate are the same. And this is, so when we're dealing with dense data, although we are implicitly always taking advantage of this fact that the position of the data and its coordinate are the same, in sparse data, we can't do that, because we could have a representation where we just list the non-zero coordinates and their associated payloads. And now the position in the array doesn't tell us anything about actually where the data, what its coordinate was. It just says here's a tuple of coordinates and payloads. And so there's cases where one representation is going to be advantageous or not. And there's lots of choices. You could do what I refer to as representations of the fiber that are implicit, where the coordinates are implicit. They don't ever appear in memory. That was the array or uncompressed representation. Or it could be compressed. I could do a run length encoding. I can have explicit coordinates, like the coordinate payload list we just drew. So what I'm just going to say here is that, so you have a choice for any fiber of making it implicit coordinates or explicit coordinates, making it compressed or not. And I'm using compressed here as an attribute of the representation. I'm going to try very hard to use the word sparsity and density as an attribute of the data. So I'm going to try not to talk about a dense representation. Obviously, uncompressed is a good representation for dense data, and coordinate payload list is a good representation for sparse data, but the representation itself is not dense or sparse. Uncompressed means that the size is proportional to the maximum coordinate, and compressed formats typically will have metadata overhead relative to uncompressed formats. That means for dense data, may be worse to use a compressed format than just using an uncompressed format. And as a consequence, the spatial efficiency of a representation depends upon the sparsity. what was proposed, I think I don't have a slide. What was proposed in some work by in some Armasingos group by Fred Kajolstad and the Taco work was that if you think of a tensor as having this series of ranks, I can pick a fiber representation for each rank. And so here's an example. In the top rank, I'm going to use an uncompressed format. What does the payload of each element have to do? Well, it has to tell me where in the next rank is the fiber of interest. So this is saying, well, it's at 0. The next element is telling me how long the fiber is. And this is saying that there's a fiber at 2, but it's of 0 length. And this is saying that there's a fiber at location 2 of length 2. So that's an uncompressed representation. I could have a compressed representation where I have the coordinates 0, 2, and their payloads AC, and the other fiber has coordinates 0, 1, and its payload GH. Those of you familiar will immediately say, oh, you just created compressed sparse row, where that top fiber is called the segment array, the next one is called the coordinate array, and then I have a value array. And many people express their algorithms in terms of manipulation of this concrete representation. So I'm going to ask you to remember back to the traversal of the 2D array. It was about 4 lines of Python-ish code. The same code for traversing a CSR format is like this. And I have a terrible time trying to figure out the algorithm from all the computations that are going on here. So that's why the abstraction helps. It doesn't tell you exactly what the performance is, but it does tell you what the algorithm is in a much simpler form. Okay, so now that we've got an abstract representation and the notion that we can do algorithms expressed with that abstraction, and we know that later that we're going to pick a concrete representation, what about the schedule? The schedule is actually going to be the same as we saw before. If this is my einsum representing a 1D convolution, I am going to just be able to express a loop nest which says put the Q's so that they're traversed, the Q coordinates so they're traversed most rapidly, and traverse the sparse weights most slowly. And I have a representation here where the F, or the filter weights, is a tensor. And I'm simply asserting that the inputs and outputs are uncompressed arrays. So this data flow, I added as a question, is weight stationary, because this is the outer loop. And it has sparse weights. I do a very nice traversal of the filter weights. I skip empty weights. So I'm going to save time in that outer loop by never spending an iteration for a weight that was empty, was 0. The terminology we use is that when we step through the elements of a fiber in position order, nice order, or even in a multi-dimensional structure, multi-rank structure, if we step through it in a depth first, that's a very nice traversal order. Instead of saying depth first, which implies tree, we refer to it as concordant order. This was a term coined by a colleague of mine, Michael Plower. I also needed to do a projection of Q and S. Remember, because we saw arithmetic here, we knew we needed to do a projection. So we're computing the W coordinate based on Q and S, and then we do the computation appropriately with the operation and the reduction, and then we finally populate an output. This corresponds to this hardware. I won't go through the details, but just like the dense computation that we did imply the data flow loop nest implied the hardware. We can see that the sparse computation also implies the hardware. And we see that there's a latch here that's holding the weight because it's weight stationary. The weights are in a sparse data structure, dotted line around it. The others are in uncompressed data structures. So this is sparse data. If I wanted to do the full DNN computation, I would need to add loop nests for the 2D input activations and filters. I'd handle multiple input channels, multiple output channels. All of that's fairly straightforward for adding more loop nests to it. We saw how to traverse multidimensional structures. I also might want to add parallelism. So how do I add parallelism to this? Well, what we're going to do is let's assume that we want to have by 2 parallelism. So I actually want to take my in this case 1D filters and split them up. And so what we're going to do is we're going to split them up. When I split them up, I want to keep the result a tensor. And so I create a 2-rank tensor, and I just name it. I had an original rank S. I'm now going to have new ranks S0 and S1. I'm going to have a fiber in the top, and I'm going to assign a coordinate to the first 2 elements. So I grab the first 2 elements, and I create a fiber in the second rank. I then grab the next 2 elements. So I put a coordinate in the top rank and add a fiber with 2 elements in the next rank. And I add another, finally I grab the last 2, 8 and 9, coordinates 8 and 9, and put a coordinate in the top rank, and its payload is a fiber in the next rank. Now I have a structure which is a 2D, a rank 2 tensor, 2-dimensional tensor, which allows me to grab fibers with 2 elements in it, which then becomes natural to say, do those in parallel. I had some question. So what can I do here? I do a loop here where I take that original filters and I say split equal by 2. That does the operation that we just saw before. That returns me, when I iterate it, a series of 2-element fibers. I'm also going to split up the output array. This is just uncompressed data, so this is just standard tiling. I then have a pair of parallel 4s. One of them goes across this split fiber, which I know has exactly 2 elements. So I get 2-way parallelism, and those parallel things, each of them are going to have a coordinate and a value. I'm going to do a parallel 4 across 4 outputs. I calculate my proper coordinates for my input and my output. I access them, and I multiply my sparsely acquired filter weight value. Set all this, work on 4. I calculate the coordinates. I look up an input activation and accumulate. This is the essence, as best as I was able to understand, of the Cambricon-X accelerator design. They described it as having sets of weights in parallel. Here's their metadata, because they're describing a specific implementation. We could pick any metadata or tensor format we want. What they say is, oh, I need to get the appropriate input activations for these weights. I'm picking those in one parallel unit. I'm picking the same, a different set of weights in sequence for the other. So again, this is a pictorial representation of a part of it. It was very hard to understand. I believe that if we'd simply added the input and output channels to that previous loop nest, that we would actually describe Cambricon-X. What about exploiting both sparse inputs and sparse weights? So going back to our 1D convolution, here I'm going to traverse in an output stationary fashion. I'm going to schedule the outputs first. And then what do I need? What I need is essentially the sliding window. If you remember the picture of the output stationary, I think I didn't draw it. The filter slid along the input activations. You can think of that as projecting the coordinates of the filters on top of the input activations. So I'm doing a projection. What did I say? When we have arithmetic here, we need a projection. And arithmetic in the index, we need a projection. And we also only care about those instances where both values exist. Because I have an S here and an S here, that means that there's an intersection. So I represent an intersection between the filters and the input activations. I then take my values, multiply them together, and accumulate them in my output. I think I say what these are. Oh, I did have a picture. So here's a picture of that projection, why I needed it. Here's my filter weights that are moved over on top of a window of inputs. So what I can do is I can move my filter weights and project them so that I want to do my element-wise multiplication here to generate my output here. And I do that as I slide along. How do I do that in the fiber abstraction? Well, here's my fiber with its coordinates. I want to project them by 2. All I'm doing is adding 2 to every coordinate. Intersection. I have 2 fibers. I would like to intersect them. What does that mean? That means that I only want coordinates that exist in both fibers. So the coordinate 2 exists in both fibers. The coordinate 8 exists in both fibers. So I get 2 and 8 in the output. And what do I get as a payload? I get the tuple A and F and D and H, the elements that came from the original fibers. Now that I understand what the semantics of those operations are, that design or that data flow that I described allows me to express the hardware. I now have 2 sparse operands, the filter weights and the input activations. I step through both of them. I do an intersection, but I do an intersection on the projected value. I get out the survivors of the intersection, and I do my accumulation. Again, abstract, I got to pick a concrete representation. Well, what's a good concrete representation for doing intersection? Well, if I represent the non-empty coordinates with a bit mask, finding out where there's a non-empty coordinate in two fibers is an and of those 2 bit masks. That's what the Spartan design did. So again, ignoring handling of many input channels and output channels and multiple dimensions, this is what Spartan did. All right. So one other manipulation that you often might want to do in order to optimize your behavior is what I'll refer to as flattening ranks. And so if I have 2 ranks H and W, and I've identified the fiber tree here, And I've colored the coordinates different just so we can keep track of them. What I can do, what I can do is flatten those two ranks by taking an element from the top rank and an element from the next rank. And that creates the coordinate 0, 1, payload A. And now my coordinate, instead of being a single number, is a tuple. And I take the next one, 0, 3. I create a tuple 0, 3 and its associated payload, 4, 2 and its associated payload, and 4, 3 and its associated payload. There's lots of other flattened rank representations depending upon the concrete representation you pick. And then here is the Iris V2 data flow. I don't really have time to go through it in detail, but what is it doing? It's doing things like it's flattened the input tensor so that the C and W ranks have been flattened. It flattens the S and M ranks of the filter weights. It has an uncompressed output array. It is input stationary. It traverses the sparse inputs in the top element. It gets out the next rank of the filter weights for the current channel. It splits them to introduce some parallelism. It processes those split levels and then steps through. I'm going to end with a shameless plug. A lot of the things that we've talked about, that I've talked about here, are in a book that Vivian Z and I and some of our students put together on efficient processing of DNNs. So I am available for some questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And now, if anyone has questions, you can ask them either in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. And maybe I'll start and ask a question. One area that I see with this architectural exploration are all of these new artifacts. Is there a way to reveal these artifacts to programmers or have a way for algorithm designers to more directly use these new types of artifacts for deep neural nets?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. So far, we've largely resorted to automated searches where what the programmer sees, it's following the halide philosophy, which is the programmer specifies a problem. That problem is specified as an einsum. They can then specify a schedule which says, do things in this order, do this splitting, do these things in parallel. The manifestation of those in hardware elements is then all rote. It's all it can be made mechanical. So we're hoping that the programmer has available to them these schedule primitives, and they can play with those. And what I was saying so far is that most of our playing with the schedule primitives are done by automated search rather than human search. But they're certainly amenable to human search. And then the actual mapping of that onto the hardware primitives is an automatable process, and the programmer shouldn't have to pay attention to that.
Thank you. On the circuits that you've presented, I noticed that you didn't mention the bit width of the words, and many computations are either 8-bit, 16-bit, 64-bit. would those need to be different circuits on the chip?
Yeah. So the bit width becomes a implementation specific specification, right? So in addition to the format, the bit width is an important one. That's a good point to make. And hardware, will vary in how they cope with that. So much hardware is a particular bit width, and and if you ask for a bit width, if you ask for a different bit width, it says no. But there is hardware that is that is also flexible, that you can do different width computations on the same piece of hardware, and it sort of reconfigures itself to do 2 8-bit adds or 1 16-bit add, or multiplies. And so you can often take advantage of that, and it becomes, and so that becomes something that's part, I guess I'm using the word schedule in a very broad sense, that you would include that bit width as part of the quote schedule. And so it depends on the flexibility of the hardware. And so one of the big design trade-offs is, how much flexibility do we want to provide in the hardware?
So let me see if there are other questions.
Excuse me, can I ask 2 questions?
Sure.
Thank you. Jules, thank you for your great talk. So I have 2 questions. My first question is, do you think the sparse matrix is more efficient to be processed by CPU or GPU?
That's putting me on the spot, isn't it? I think that I think it's a function of the sparsity. So
yeah,
there are implementations of sparse matrix multiply in those. I don't actually know the benchmarks off the top of my head.
okay.
And so, but I know that for very sparse matrix multiply, the CPU can, the GPU can do very well. The Taco compiler, which does sparse matrix multiply, and other things, does very well on the CPU as well as on the GPU. And I don't know what the benchmark results are. So I'm gonna avoid that question. How about another question?
Okay, thank you. So actually, I mean, in some sparsity, if the matrix is very sparse, I mean, maybe I think it's better for CPU to do the computation, because it may waste some GPU, resources.
Well, yeah, neither of them are directly designed to be able to handle sparsity, and so in some ways the width of the GPU is not able to be exploited unless you can marshal the data together. And so one of the major research projects that I was involved with was what enhancements might you need in a GPU in order for it to be able to efficiently do more sparse computations. And we showed very dramatic speedups for that. The other thing is the GPUs already are capable of handling certain structured sparsity. This is more specific to DNN computations, where if the filter weights, because they're static, can be pruned to be what they call 2-4 sparse, meaning 2 non-zeros for every group of 4 coordinates, then you can get a speed up on the GPU using the tensor core, the high performance matrix multiply unit.
Okay, so you mean GPU already optimized for sparsity, sparse matrix?
Certain cases, what's called structured sparsity, where you know exactly where the zeros are, and exactly how many there are in a group of 4.
Okay, thank you. So my second question is, here you mentioned the sparsity in the neural network. So I wonder, so typically, what kind of neural network, for example, graph convolution neural network or something like that, they are very sparse, I mean, in reality?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. So, graph computations, and I guess I should have said, when people do graph neural networks, it comes in intrinsically very sparse.
I mean, in neural network, we have many layers. It seems that for some layers, they are kind of sparse.
Yes.
For some other layers, they're kind of dense.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, for this case, is that possible? Put some sparse matrix layers in some processing unit which are special designed for sparsity, and other density layers.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that's a great question, but and I don't know that there's any resolved answer for that. It's essentially saying, is it better to build a more flexible single engine that does well on sparse and well on dense, but it's obviously a compromise, or should I have two engines? The problem with two engines is I can optimize each of them for their case, but if I don't need that functionality, now the hardware is going idle, and so I've paid for something that I'm not using.
Yeah.
And so figuring out the sweet spot there is an open question.
Okay, I got it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So Joel, I have another question. In the circuit set that you described, you can optimize for many things. For instance, the surface area on the chip, or the performance of the circuit, or for the power efficiency. Does that change your design, those different types of optimizations?
Oh, absolutely. So area on the chip is cost. So that, so generally designs are cost constrained. They say, you can do whatever you want within this area. So then maybe that makes the optimization a little easier, because you say, okay, what's the best I can do within that area? Oftentimes there also is a power constraint. And so what then you're trying to do is maximize performance within an area and power envelope. But in research, we might also say, okay, can we trade performance for energy, and because it's a nonlinear trade-off. And so sometimes you do look at that, and even dynamic systems do that. That's what they call DVFS, where they can drop the voltage in order to save energy. And dropping voltage is actually quadratic savings in energy, but a linear savings. It can be a linear degradation in performance. And so yes, you do play those trade-offs in designs.
So again, Joel, thank you for giving this talk. I think it's very timely as we see these types of neural networks advancing, and it's very interesting to see how computer architecture is addressing these challenges. So again,
thank you. Me. It was very nice.
Take care, and we'll see everybody later.
Okay.
Bye-bye.